Hi there, I'm Kadiesha and we're going to talk about the changing role of women in the 1960s. Society does not permit women to accept or gratify their potentialities as human beings. Betty Friedan said this in the 1960s, at the very beginning, when she started rallying women and trying to get rights for women that they hadn't had before. To really understand what it was like for a woman in the 1960s, you have to understand what it was like for a woman in the 1950s. In the 1950s, women really didn't have any rights. They married, had kids, and they were housewives. And they took care of their husbands. They cooked the dinner, kept the house clean, and reared the children. And that was their job. They didn't really go to college, or get jobs, or further their career or education. So by analyzing the social, political, and historical perspectives, one can better understand the significance of what these women and their daughters were feeling, and how it sparked a change of women's roles in America. So let's talk about the timeline of all this. The first thing we're going to talk about is how it was in the 1950s and how it repressed a woman's potentiality to become a better person and further their career. Then we're going to talk about Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, hoping women would read it and realize they weren't the only ones who felt repressed and unfulfilled by their lives as housewives. Then we'll talk about Helen Brown. She wrote a book called Sex and the Single Girl. It was the first book highlighting a single woman's sex life, and it kind of created an uproar. Then we'll talk about music in the last third of the 1960s, and how teenage girls listened to this music and started to feel more individualized.
When the truth is found.
Then we'll talk about sex rights. In 1967, abortion rights and sex rights were starting to become approved in a lot of states. First, we're going to talk about the ideal family. In the 1950s, the ideal family was a husband and wife settling down, having kids, and living in a nice house. They usually married rather young, women usually at 19 years old, and men at 22. Divorce was unheard of in the 1950s. If you were a divorced man, you were seen as unable to take care of your family and as a loser. If you were a woman, you were seen as a victim. Women were supposed to feel fulfilled as housewives, nothing more. They weren't supposed to want to go to college or further their lives, or, better themselves. At the end of the 1950s, women began to realize that they weren't fulfilled as housewives, and began to question what they were doing with their lives. Betty Friedan was one of the first to speak up about it. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. Women read it and realized that they weren't the only ones unfulfilled, and started speaking out about it. Thus began the fight for complete equal rights. Betty Friedan started doing things in the 1960s, like speaking out, writing her book, and rallying women in peaceful marches. Kind of like Martin Luther King. These things were happening around the same time, so it makes sense that their styles were quite similar. Along with Betty Friedan was Helen Brown, who wrote a book. She wrote about the sex life of a single woman, and how to be a single woman without getting married, and how to take care of yourself. Because women in the 1950s didn't know how to take care of themselves. Their husbands had been doing it for so long. So women in the 1960s had to learn. Grace Slick was a musician. You might know her for her famous song White Rain. She was a part of 4 bands: The Great Society, Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, and Starship. Soon she became a musical spokeswoman for the equal rights movement. Another big step in the political march. Women wanted abortions for victims of rape or incest. They wanted help for women who might be damaged emotionally or physically by giving birth. And they wanted help or options for women whose children were deformed or mentally retarded. The first state to legalize abortion was Colorado. Governor John Love signed off on the bill in 1967. Many states afterwards followed suit, and abortion became almost a nationwide thing by the 1980s. Now we're going to talk about the major changes that these women set in motion by doing these things that they did. Starting in the 1960s, women stayed single longer, not settling down, not marrying men, and taking care of themselves. More women got jobs, went to college, furthered their careers, and lived their lives. Less women had children, so they could stay in the workforce and further their careers. Of course, in the 1960s, every state has legal abortion in it, at least somewhere, in one county or another. Of course, abortion is a very controversial topic and people are still fighting it today. Some people are pro-choice, while others are pro-life. One of the things that is almost non-existent today is discrimination against women. Women in the 1960s drastically lowered hate crime, sex crime, and discrimination against women nowadays. Of course, women are still discriminated against, especially in the workforce. In some corporations, women are still paid less than men, which is something we're still fighting for today. So now it's easier for us to understand how women like Betty Friedan and Helen Brown paved the way for women today. Women became politically active. They wrote books, got jobs, married later in their lives, went to college,